The moment I met Jane, it was like the world paused, just for a second, to make sure I took notice. I remember the exact way her smile lit up the corner of the room at that trade fair, like she wasn't just standing under the lights but was commanding them. I'd walked in that day expecting another series of endless conversations about market trends and investment opportunities. I didn't expect her. She was different from anyone I'd ever met, confident without being arrogant, charming but grounded. Jane Foster didn't just have a seat at the table. She owned the damn room without even trying. She had this knack for seeing right through my polished exterior, the one I've perfected after years in investment banking. She didn't care about my title or my success. She cared about me, Franklin Richards, the guy who trips over his words when he's nervous and secretly loves cheesy romantic comedies. Our condo in New York City feels like the life I've always dreamed of, modern, sleek, a little piece of calm in the chaos of Manhattan. But what really makes it home is Jane. She's the one who insisted on adding plants to our living room, even though I swore I'd kill them in a week. Spoiler, they're thriving because she keeps them alive, not me. She brings life to every space she's in. We've been planning the wedding, and every detail feels surreal. In just a few months, I'll be marrying the woman who challenges me, inspires me, and somehow, against all odds, puts up with me. Sometimes I look at her across the table, her brow furrowed as she sips her coffee and pores over some new project for work, and I have to remind myself that this isn't a dream. She's real. She chose me. I still wonder what I did to deserve someone like Jane. She's fiercely independent, insanely talented, and God, she's beautiful. But more than anything, she's the reason I look forward to coming home at the end of a grueling day. And soon, she'll be the reason I say I do and promise her forever. She's it for me. My beginning, my middle, my end. At least that is what I believed, or that is what I had in my mind. Things started to change the moment Laura walked back into Jane's life. I didn't even know Jane had a childhood friend living in Germany until she showed up one evening with a bottle of Riesling and a smirk that made my stomach churn. I wanted to be polite. I really did. For Jane's sake. But from the first words out of Laura's mouth, it was clear. She didn't like me, and I sure as hell didn't like her. She didn't waste any time digging her claws in, making snide remarks about my job, the condo, even the way I held Jane's hand. "You're lucky Jane's so patient," she said once with a condescending grin, like she was daring me to bite back. And believe me, I wanted to. But I knew Jane wouldn't appreciate me losing my temper. Instead, I stayed calm, outsmarting her at every turn. Her digs never landed, and the satisfaction of watching her squirm when I outworded her was almost worth the frustration of her presence. But Laura wasn't just a nuisance. She was a problem. Jane started to change around her. She'd laugh off Laura's comments about how she didn't need a man, or how she could do better than me. At first, I thought it was harmless, just two friends joking around. But then Jane began questioning things about us, about me. Little things at first, like whether I was too controlling about the wedding plans, then bigger things, like whether she needed to find herself before settling down. I could see what was happening. Laura was a bad influence, plain and simple. She didn't believe in relationships, at least not the kind Jane and I had. Laura was the type to glorify independence to the point of isolation, and she was pulling Jane in with her cynicism disguised as empowerment. It wasn't fine with me. I loved Jane, and I knew we were good together. I wasn't some controlling partner trying to clip her wings. I wanted to build a life with her, one where we both thrived. But Laura? She was planting seeds of doubt in Jane's mind, and it was tearing us apart. There were moments when I almost lost it. Once, after one too many of her passive-aggressive jabs in my house, I stood up, fists clenched, and told her she needed to leave. Jane stepped in before I could finish, pleading with me to calm down. "She's my friend, Franklin," she said, her voice trembling. "Why can't you just get along?" It stung because I knew why. I wasn't the issue here, Laura was. But Jane couldn't see it, or maybe she didn't want to. It was causing cracks in our relationship, cracks I didn't know how to fix. Every argument about Laura left us more distant, and every day she stayed in our lives felt like a step further away from the life Jane and I had planned. I could feel her slipping through my fingers, and the worst part? It felt like there was nothing I could do about it. The tension had been simmering for weeks, but when Laura proposed the girls' only trip to Europe a month before the wedding, it felt like someone had dropped a match into a room filled with gasoline. I couldn't believe the audacity of it. Laura, the very person who had been driving a wedge between Jane and me, now wanted to whisk her away right before we were supposed to commit to spending our lives together? It wasn't just disrespectful, it was calculated. "Absolutely not," I said, trying to stay calm but failing miserably. We're about to get married, Jane. This isn't the time to go on some escapade with her. Laura, of course, jumped at the chance to paint me as the villain. See? This is exactly what I've been telling you, Jane. He's trying to control your life. This is why men are the worst. They suffocate you, clip your wings, and then expect you to thank them for it. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. The nerve of this woman to stand in my home and act like I was some sort of tyrant. I clenched my fists, willing myself to take the high road, but then she said it again. Control. Like I was nothing more than an obstacle to Jane's freedom. That's when I snapped. You know what, Laura? Maybe your dad should have used a rubber when you were conceived, because you're nothing but a walking disaster. The room went silent. Jane's eyes widened in shock, and for a second, even Laura looked stunned. But then she exploded. She started yelling about how I was toxic, how this was exactly what she'd been warning Jane about, and how no woman deserved to be treated like this. Jane tried to step in, her voice shaky. Franklin, that was uncalled for. Laura is my friend, and you? No. I cut her off, my voice firm but cold. You need to listen to me, Jane. Laura isn't just your friend. She's poison. She's been trying to sabotage us from the moment she walked through that door, and if you can't see that by now, then I don't know what to tell you. Jane opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't done. If you go on this trip, Jane, then we're done. I'm serious. I'm not going to marry someone who lets someone like her dictate our relationship. Laura is trash, and you deserve better than to let her drag you down with her. I could see the hurt in Jane's eyes, but at that moment, I didn't care. I was furious, not just at Laura but at Jane too, for not standing up for us, for letting this toxic person plant doubts where there should have been trust. Laura stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Jane just stood there, tears welling up, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Maybe she didn't. Maybe I didn't recognize myself, either. But I'd reached my breaking point, and something had to give. Now, the ball was in Jane's court, and for the first time, I wasn't sure what she was going to do. That night started out tense, as most nights have been lately. Laura, ever the disruptor, had called Jane, inviting her to a club for a night of dancing. I could hear the excitement in Jane's voice as she glanced at me, her eyes pleading for permission she didn't even want to admit she was asking for. I didn't even let her finish. No, I said, my tone flat and unwavering. You know how I feel about her. After everything, you're really considering this? Jane sighed, clearly torn. It's just dancing, Franklin. It's not like we're robbing a bank. She's trying to what? Drive a bigger wedge between us? I snapped. Every time you let her pull you into her nonsense, it's another nail in the coffin of what we're building. The silence was deafening. Jane put her phone down and told Laura she wasn't going. But the look on her face wasn't one of agreement. It was resignation. Laura, of course, went to the club alone. And that's when the fight really started. You can't keep controlling my life, Franklin, Jane yelled, her voice breaking. I stayed home for you tonight, but it's like nothing is ever enough. You just want me to cut everyone out until there's no one left but you. I could feel my anger bubbling over. This isn't about control, Jane. It's about respect, about protecting what we have. But if you can't see that, then maybe we're wasting our time here. Before I could say something I'd regret, I grabbed my jacket and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I needed to clear my head, so I called Jake, my oldest and most dependable friend. He was always the one I turned to when life felt like it was spinning out of control. We met at his place, where he was lounging with a beer in hand and a box of snacks on the table. Rough night? He asked with a knowing smirk as he handed me a drink. You have no idea, I muttered, collapsing onto the couch. Jake, in his usual laid-back way, produced a small bag of mushrooms from his kitchen. Maybe this'll help you chill out. It's been a minute since we had a real adventure, huh? Normally, I'd have refused. But tonight? Tonight, I was tired of thinking, tired of feeling, tired of fighting. So, I shrugged and took one. At first, nothing happened. But then the walls seemed to breathe, the colors in the room pulsing like they were alive. Jake was laughing at something, but his voice echoed like it was coming from another dimension. Suddenly, the weight of my anger and frustration lifted, replaced by this overwhelming sensation of interconnectedness. The dream started so vividly that I didn't even realize it was a dream at first. I was back in the condo, pacing the living room, my mind a whirlwind of anger and frustration. Suddenly, the phone rang. I answered it, and Jane's voice was on the other end, shaking with panic. Franklin, it's Laura. She went to the club, and something terrible happened. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could see the scene playing out in my mind. Laura, alone in that club, surrounded by men with cruel intentions. Jane didn't have to say it, but I knew. Laura had been assaulted. When I got to the hospital, Jane was waiting for me. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. But when she saw me, they filled with fury. "This is your fault," she spat. "You made her go alone. If you hadn't been so controlling, she wouldn't have been there by herself." "No," I stammered, shaking my head. "I didn't make her go. This isn't on me." But Jane wasn't listening. "You'll pay for this, Franklin," she said, her voice low and cold. "I'll make sure you regret every single thing you've ever done." Despite the ominous warning, the next part of the dream shifted. Somehow, we still got married. I didn't understand it, but there we were, standing at the altar, saying our vows. For a while, life seemed okay, peaceful, even. The fight stopped. Jane smiled more. We were happy, or so I thought. Then came the day at the hospital. Jane was in labor, and I was by her side, holding her hand, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. When the baby was born, the room fell silent. My heart stopped when I saw the child, a beautiful baby, but undeniably mixed race. I turned to Jane, my face pale. What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jane looked at me, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. And then she laughed. Not the light, musical laugh I'd fallen in love with, but a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. "Welcome to your new life, Franklin. Your hell has just begun." The next thing I knew, I was back at the condo. On the kitchen counter were divorce papers, already signed by Jane. She'd claimed everything. The condo, the savings, even the investments I'd worked my entire career to build. Attached to the papers was a restraining order. I was being labeled as a domestic abuser. I tried to fight it, but the system was stacked against me. Word spread quickly, and soon, I lost my job. My colleagues avoided me, my friends stopped calling, and my reputation was in ruins. One day, as I sat in the wreckage of what used to be my life, I saw a photo online. Jane and Laura, sitting together on a beach somewhere, smiling. Laura raised a glass to the camera as if to toast my downfall. In that moment, the weight of everything crushed me. I screamed, the sound raw and broken, but no one was there to hear it. And then I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The mushrooms had worn off, and reality came rushing back. It was just a dream, a terrible, twisted nightmare. But the feelings it left behind? Those were real. The anger, the fear, the guilt. I sat there in the dark, wondering if it was a warning. If my worst fears about Laura, about Jane, about everything, weren't just in my head after all. When I got home, the air felt thick, like something was off. And then I saw her, Laura, sitting on my couch, smirking like she owned the place. Jane was in the kitchen, pouring wine, acting like this was completely normal. "Why is she here?" I asked, my voice sharp but controlled. Jane turned, trying to look casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Laura canceled her plans last night because of everything. So tonight she thought we could hang out. And we decided to go out. Just the two of us." I felt my stomach twist, but instead of letting the anger take over, I smiled. A calm, measured smile that even I didn't expect. "You can go," I said simply. Both Jane and Laura froze, surprised by my reaction. Laura's smirk quickly returned, but there was a flicker of something else. Hesitation, maybe. "Wow," she said, leaning back against the couch. "I guess the boy finally knows his place." I didn't even flinch. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, "but I guess you still need to figure out yours." Her smirk faltered for just a moment, but she covered it up with a laugh. "Whatever," she said, standing up and grabbing her bag. "Come on, Jane. Let's go." Jane looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something. Approval, maybe? Or doubt. But I didn't give her anything. I just stood there, calm and collected, as they walked out the door. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the quiet apartment. I stood there for a moment, the smile fading from my face. Let them have their night, I thought. Let them feel like they've won. Because something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to play this game anymore. But that didn't mean I wasn't planning my next move. The call came at midnight, jolting me out of a restless sleep. Jane's father's voice on the other end was frantic and shaky. "Franklin, you need to come to the hospital. It's Jane and Laura." Something happened. I didn't ask questions. I just threw on my clothes and drove like a madman to the hospital. When I arrived, I found Jane's father pacing in the waiting room, his face pale and full of worry. "She's in there," he said, pointing toward one of the rooms. "They're both saying they were assaulted." My stomach churned, but something about his tone made me pause. It wasn't just worry, it was confusion. I stepped into the room, and there they were. Jane, lying on the hospital bed, looking pale and shaken, and Laura, sitting in a chair beside her, her usual smugness replaced with a thin veneer of distress. "Jane," I said, my voice steady, but cold. "What happened?" Jane avoided my gaze, her hands fidgeting with the hospital blanket. Laura, on the other hand, perked up immediately, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "What happened?" "We were attacked, Franklin. This is exactly why I said Jane should never have trusted you. If you had been there—" "Stop," I said sharply, cutting her off. I turned to Jane's father, who looked like he was bracing for something. "Mr. Clark, I appreciate your concern, but I'm here to tell you this. The wedding is off. I'll have Jane's clothes packed and sent to your place by morning." Jane's head snapped up, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. "What? Franklin, you can't be serious." Laura jumped to her feet, her outrage immediate. "You're running away because something bad happened to her? You're pathetic." I smiled bitterly, pulling my phone from my pocket. "Oh, I'm not running. I just don't tolerate liars." I tapped the screen a few times and turned the phone toward them. The video played clearly, a security feed from a nearby hotel. It showed Jane and Laura walking arm in arm with a group of men, laughing and flirting as they entered the hotel lobby. An hour later, they emerged, still laughing, and hailed a cab. "According to the doctors," I said, my voice low but cutting, "there's no evidence of any assault. None. And now we both know why." Jane's face went pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Franklin, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I interrupted. "You and your best friend cooked up some story because you didn't want to face the consequences of your own actions. But I'm done. I don't marry liars. And I certainly don't marry someone who would disrespect me like this." Laura's face twisted into rage, but before she could say anything, I silenced her with a glare. "You've done enough damage. To Jane. To me. But you won't get another second of my time." I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving behind the sound of Jane sobbing and Laura sputtering in indignation. By the time I got to my car, I felt an odd sense of relief. It was over. Whatever spell Jane had over me was broken, and I could finally see clearly. Sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that set you free. It had been a few days since I'd walked out of that hospital, leaving Jane and Laura behind. The weight of everything still hung over me, but I was determined to move on. That night, as I walked back to my apartment from a late meeting, I felt the distinct sensation of being followed. I turned a corner into a dimly lit alley. Stupid, I know, but I wanted to confront whoever it was. That's when it happened. A man lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. Fortunately for him, I've been a black belt in judo for years, and muscle memory kicked in. With a quick sidestep and a well-placed throw, I disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. He squirmed beneath me, cursing and yelling, but I didn't let up. "Who sent you?" I demanded, my voice ice cold. The man hesitated, his face twisting with a mix of anger and shame. "Laura," he spat finally. "She said you ruined her and Jane's life. Told me to teach you a lesson." My grip tightened. "And you agreed to this? Why?" "I'm her lover," he said, his words dripping with defiance. "One of the guys from the hotel that night." "Jane, Laura." "Me? It wasn't what you think, man. We all had fun. Laura she wanted to get back at you after what you pulled." My stomach churned, but I kept my composure. "You have proof of this?" The man smirked, clearly proud of himself. "Hell yeah. I got videos. Figured they might be useful someday." I yanked him to his feet, pushing him against the alley wall. "Show me," I ordered. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his gallery. Sure enough, there they were. Videos of Laura and Jane, laughing and drinking with him and his friends. The images turned more explicit, confirming everything I'd already suspected. I grabbed his phone and sent the files to myself before tossing it back to him. "Get out of my sight," I said, my voice low and dangerous. He hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his options, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him. He turned and bolted, leaving me standing alone in the alley, the weight of what I'd just uncovered settling over me. As I walked back to my apartment, my mind raced. I had the proof now, not just of their lies, but of their sheer malice. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The next morning, I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't surprised when I opened it and found Jane standing there, her face a mix of defiance and desperation. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "We need to talk," she said sharply. "Make it quick," I replied, leaning against the counter, my expression blank. She took a deep breath and launched into it. "You need to marry me, Franklin. You owe me that." "My child." I cut her off. "Your child?" "Yes," she snapped. "My child needs a father. You may not want to do the right thing, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and cold. "Let's not pretend this is about morality, Jane. You're looking for a meal ticket, not a father for your kid. But let's clear one thing up. If you're so sure this is my child, let's get a DNA test." Her face hardened. "No, I'm not subjecting myself or my baby to your ridiculous accusations." "Then I have my answer," I said, pushing off the counter. "There's nothing more to discuss. Get out." Jane's demeanor shifted instantly, her voice dropping into a dangerous tone. "You think you can just walk away from this, Franklin? If you don't marry me, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you are. I'll file assault charges, harassment, abuse, whatever it takes. You might be able to fight the charges, but by the time it's over, your career, your reputation, all gone." I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that caught her off guard. Without a word, I turned my laptop around so she could see the screen. Her expression changed from anger to confusion, then to horror as the video started to play. There she was, with Laura and the men from the hotel, clear as day, laughing, drinking, and eventually engaging in the kind of behavior she'd been so eager to lie about. You recorded this?" she stammered. "No," I said, my tone calm. "Your boyfriend from that night was happy to share. But there's more." I clicked on another file, and the room was filled with her own voice, threatening me with false charges, spelling out her plan to ruin me if I didn't comply. Jane's face turned white as I opened an email draft on the screen. The files were attached, and the recipients were listed: her employer, her family, and the authorities. "Let me show you how serious I am," I said, my finger hovering over the mouse. With one click, I sent the email, watching as the notification confirmed it had gone through. Jane's hands trembled as she stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. You can't do this." I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. "Get out of here, Jane. Go fight the fire I just lit. And don't ever come near me again." She turned and stumbled out the door, her panic visible in every step. 2 days later, the nightmare I thought I had closed the door on came knocking, literally. Jane and Laura stood at my doorstep, faces set with anger and determination. Against my better judgment, I let them in, if only to avoid them causing a scene in the hallway. "What do you want now?" I asked, folding my arms and leaning against the door. Jane spoke first, her voice strained. "You owe me, Franklin, for the time we spent together, for everything I gave up to be with you." I blinked at her in disbelief before a bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Oh, you? Are you serious? Jane, are you a prostitute now? Because that's the only way this demand makes any sense." Her face flushed with shame, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the old Jane, the one who might have felt remorse or regret. But then she steeled herself. "I deserve something for everything I went through." I shook my head, my patience wearing thin. "You deserve exactly what you've earned, which is nothing from me. Now, both of you need to leave before I call the cops." Laura, as always, couldn't keep her mouth shut. She stepped forward, her voice rising. "You think you're better than us? You're just a spineless man who hides behind his money. If you're not going to give Jane what she deserves, at least help me. I need a loan." That caught me off guard. "A loan? You've got to be kidding me." Laura's tone shifted, desperate now. "I'm in debt to someone dangerous. If I don't pay up, it's my life on the line." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch before replying. "You don't know how to ask, do you?" Her confusion turned to anger. "What? If you want my help, you'll have to learn some humility," I said coldly. Laura hesitated, then slowly dropped to her knees, her face a mixture of fury and humiliation. "Please," she said through gritted teeth, "help me." I leaned down, meeting her eyes with a smirk. "Now you know your place." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $1 bill, and tossed it onto the floor in front of her. "That's all you're worth. Take it and get out." Jane stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as Laura's face twisted in rage. She lunged at me, her scream echoing through the room, but I was ready. I had already called the cops when I saw them approaching my door, and right on cue, there was a knock. The officers stepped in, separating Laura from me as she thrashed and shouted obscenities. Jane tried to defend her, but the officers weren't having it. After a brief explanation and a quick review of the security footage from my building, they placed both women in handcuffs. As they were led away, Jane turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and despair. "This isn't over, Franklin," she spat. I stood in the doorway, watching as they disappeared down the hall. "Oh, it's over," I muttered to myself, closing the door behind them. For the first time in weeks, my home felt peaceful again. A few days later, as I was heading home, something unexpected caught my attention. A pair of screams pierced the air, sharp and desperate. I turned my head to see two women being dragged by several men toward a car. One of the women, though I couldn't see her clearly at first, screamed Jane's name, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice. "That's my boyfriend. He'll give you the money." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew that voice. Without thinking, I stepped closer, trying to make sense of the scene. One of the men turned toward me, his face hardened with menace. "Are you her boyfriend?" he asked, his tone flat but dangerous. I stared at him for a moment, taking in the situation. Then, with a slight shrug, I answered, "Nope, never seen that woman." The man paused, then grinned, as if my response had been the punchline of a joke. "Well, then she's going to pay the right way." With that, they shoved Jane and the other woman into the back of the car, the engine roaring to life. The men climbed in, the car peeling away from the curb in a cloud of exhaust. I stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear around the corner, a strange mix of emotions swirling within me. I could have done something, maybe. I could have tried to intervene, tried to help, but the truth was, I felt nothing for Jane anymore, and the thought of getting tangled in her mess again made my stomach turn. Turning away from the street, I walked back to my apartment, the sound of the car fading into the distance. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The past was finally behind me, and I was done being dragged back into it. It was time to move on. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.